1. Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Wednesday, the 17th of April 2024. Today we're examining how the civil service supports whistleblowers. We all know that whistleblowing is an important, in fact an essential part of good government. It allows people working in the civil service to raise concerns about malpractice and wrongdoing where they see it, and it's really important that there's a culture across the civil service which supports whistleblowers to do that. And we are looking particularly today, with thanks to the National Audit Office for their work on this, at consistency across different departments in the civil service. It's nearly 8 years since the Public Accounts Committee looked at this last, and we were disappointed then about a lack of urgency in dealing with the process, and we're concerned, looking at the report from the National Audit Office, that there's still some issues around data being collected on how cases are dealt with, about the lack of data on the experience of whistleblowers who are going through the process, which is obviously really key, and the outcomes of whistleblowing. So we're hoping really to get into a good, honest discussion with our witnesses today about how whistleblowing can be improved and support for whistleblowers can be improved in the civil service. I should stress to people that we're not looking beyond the civil service, so we're not looking at NHS England today or other organisations, and we're very much looking at the systems. But we are delighted to have two witnesses from government departments to hopefully illustrate some of the points that we are hoping to discuss, and that is Helen Pickles, who's the Interim Director General for People and Capability at the DWP. Are you still interim?
Yes.
Good luck, I guess, possibly in that role. And then Esther Wallington, who's the Chief People Officer at HMRC. Both are here really because they've got very large departments of directly employed civil servants and often dealing with very challenging issues. And leading from the Cabinet Office, we have Fiona Ryland, who's the Government Chief People Officer there, and she's with Matthew Davies, who's the HR Deputy Director at the Cabinet Office. So thank you very much indeed for coming. So really I wanted to go back to what I said, we've looked at this before as a committee, and we had concerns back in 2016 about this. Do you think that the Cabinet Office, Fiona Ryland, has a better understanding of how effective whistleblowing is across government departments, that you've got a better visibility of what's going on in the civil service than you did then?
Yes, I do, and I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about the role of the Cabinet Office in terms of this. So we develop and keep up to date the model policy. We also provide tools such as training kits for nominated officers, policy leads, HR professionals. Since 2016, we've implemented the annual data collection process so that we have got a data set around the number of cases, the nature of those cases, the time taken to deal with those cases across the civil service. We have also implemented the annual health check. So this is a tool that departments can use to self-assess themselves against our model policies and practices. And we have done some things that encourage sharing of best practice as well. So our online knowledge hub and our annual conference for nominated officers and policy leads.
Okay, and so you have that overall visibility, but you talk about the data. What the National Audit Office has highlighted is there are quite important data gaps there about what you following through, and that different departments are doing things differently. How are you trying to make sure that there is greater consistency? And given that we last looked at this nearly 8 years ago, why is it taking so long?
Yeah, so I think what we have got is a good foundation in terms of the annual data collection. So I think that is consistent data across civil service departments and agencies around, as I've said, the number, the nature, the time it takes to close. I think the NA report highlighted some useful areas for us to work on. So the use of data in that annual health check does vary across departments. So some departments literally go through and gather that evidence line by line, others do it by exception. So one thing that we are going to work on is working with departments to provide additional guidance and training to try and get more consistent use of data in that process. I think the other helpful things that the NAO highlighted was in the data collection, asking specifically for data and evidence around any cases brought by whistleblowers who feel that they have suffered a detriment for bringing an issue to our attention. That hasn't come through the data, but we need to ask that specifically, so we will do that going forward. And the other thing is understanding the experience of the whistleblower more. So we're working with departments to implement an anonymous feedback survey so that we've got some more experiential data to be able to improve the whistleblower's experience.
We're going to come on later particularly to the experience of whistleblowers, but if I can just ask Helen, Pickles and Esther Wallington to give examples of how your departments are providing data to the Cabinet Office and where you think you may have need to improve it. Helen Pickles first.
Yes, so we complete the annual health check to the Cabinet Office and also comply with the annual data return. We have recognised that we need to do more with our arm's length bodies, so we wrote out to them in March alongside the request to submit their annual data, asking them for the first time this year to ensure that they also complete the health check as well. And then just to add to what Fiona was saying, I think we really welcome the approach that the Cabinet Office has taken in recent years, certainly in terms of nominated officer training, the network that provides across government for sharing best practice as well, are all things that we value and use as a department to ensure that we are making use and learning from other departments' experience and sharing our own best practice with other departments as well.
You talk about your best practice, but are there areas that you think that DWP has got to focus on more, areas where you think you're not as good as you could be?
I think that oversight of our arm's length bodies is something that we've recognised. Also, as well as Fiona said, the experience of whistleblowers. So again, that's something we are working with the Cabinet Office on, to introduce that survey for whistleblowers where we know who they are, to understand their experience, and we will be introducing that in the department from May this year as well.
And will you also be looking at people who might have thought about whistleblowing but didn't, because people who do, it's quite a big step to be a whistleblower, because you've presumably gone through your line manager and all the other routes before you get to the whistleblowing point. So where you kind of get the culture embedded that it's okay to raise concerns, often short of whistleblowing, because you might not need to do it if there's a good culture in this department.
So within DWP, as the report highlights, we have an independent whistleblowing hotline run by the Government Independent Audit Office. So we have that approach in place, and we've kept that in place. So actually, incidents that are raised through line management might not necessarily be labelled as whistleblowing. That's all part of what we try to encourage, as having that more kind of inclusive culture where people feel free to speak up. So we make sure that we are promoting all of that good practice through things like the annual Speak Up campaign. We have respect champions at Director General level within the department as well, trying to create that culture within the department of highlighting wrongdoing, be that through the whistleblowing channel and the formal whistleblowing approach, but equally, as you say, raising that with line managers, raising that with ambassadors for fair treatment in the department, where we have around 800 of those in the department at the moment.
So can you tell us what makes you become an ambassador for fair treatment? Do people volunteer?
Yeah, so people volunteer and then go through some training, and then they are, in a local office, they would be visible to staff in that office. If you went on our departmental intranet, that would take you through to the link so that you would be able to find a local ambassador for fair treatment.
How many of them do you have now?
Around 800 in the department. I think it was 796 at the last count, but yes, it's around 800.
Very precise number. We like people who are on top of their numbers.
I'll stay with around 800.
Yeah, around 800. Okay, so that means that if you're like in the job centre in Hackney, for example, and you go to that person.
Yeah.
And get advice. Thank you, that's helpful. Esther Wallington, the same questions to you.
Yeah. So the data we do comply with the Cabinet Office, and we participate in the health check as well. So Cabinet Office do have HMRC data, and of course we use the data that comes from the Cabinet Office to learn about areas of improvement. As the others have said, we really welcome the recommendations in the report, and do need to focus as well on how we collect information about the experience of whistleblowers. At the moment, we do know quite a bit about the experience through our nominated officers, but we don't record that in a way that could be reported on. So we do need to do further work there, and there are always better ways that we can manage the data and make sure that we're collecting what we need.
Okay, thank you. Paula Barker,
Can I just pick up on that, Miss Wallington, if I may? You said you know of experience through nominated officers and things can be done better. So the question is, why don't you do better?
Every whistleblowing experience, I think, is really different, and we're talking about quite small numbers of people. So our nominated officers, we've got 16 in the department, are really highly trained to be able to provide support to people, whatever their the concern is that they've raised, and really responding to their individual circumstances. So we really rely on them and the relationship that they build with the whistleblower to support that whistleblower, but also pick up on any concerns they might have, and then work with the department to make sure that we address those concerns. So in many ways, it tends to be quite individually focused, and our main focus is on providing that individual with what they need and the support that they need.
You've just said that you could do better. So how could you do better?
What we can't do is draw out of the system some sort of key reporting, so we can't pick out themes. We do know what nominated officers tell us, and of course we're talking about quite small numbers of people from one year to the next. So we have quite a lot of intelligence within the team about the sorts of issues. But what I can't do is draw out the system, for example, as a standard set of issues that we could then send into the Cabinet Office and compare across government. And that's the opportunity for us, I think, that comes out of the NAO report.
I mean, I may have misunderstood. Apologies if I have. There has been some previous work on improving service and the holding of data in respect of numbers, concerns, methods of how they were raised and outcomes being identified, and they were all identified as measures of good practice. But you've just said that you can't draw out themes, yet we know, for example, in the NAO report, 40% of whistleblowing concerns raised were in relation to fraud. So
Forgive me. So we do have all of that information. What we don't have is information directly from whistleblowers about their experience. So the sort of survey that Fiona referenced. So forgive me. That it's that particular piece of data about whistleblower experience that we don't have. We do have data on cases, on the nature of those cases, and the outcome.
And then finally, Chair, if I could just ask Ms Ryland, you spoke about the hub and sharing good practice, for example, but yet you have very little data and there is very little evidence of policies and procedures being changed as a result of whistleblowing concerns. So can you talk to us a little bit more about the sharing of good practice and how you think that is actually being managed?
Yeah, so I think on the number of policy changes based on whistleblowing complaints, I think I would make a few comments. Firstly, it's not the only way we receive feedback, so it's not the only way that we get feedback which results in us changing our policies or procedures. Also, based on other large organisations that I've worked in, the policies and procedures that we have here, I think, are quite our best practice, and I think most of the complaints that we get via whistleblowers are about people not actually following those processes, and that's the action that we have to take, as opposed to the process or policy needing to be changed. So I think that's, and I think it's hard to put a target on, what number of cases would you expect to result in a policy change. Sorry, I forgot the first part of the question you asked.
It was in relation to the sharing of good practice via the hub.
Yeah, so we do it via the hub, but what we also do is bring together nominated officers who support whistleblowers, policy leads who are responsible for the policy, and HR professionals. We're also asking departments what would they want to see us do more of. So, for example, we've had some feedback around can we share best practice from other large organisations, other governments around what they do. So I think we should continue to speak to departments about what would they find best in the area of sharing best practice.
Is there anything done to draw out whether or not it is a true whistleblowing, as in the sense of it being a matter of public interest, for example, as opposed to an aggrieved member of staff who may be complaining about something? Because in my experience, prior to coming into Parliament, I don't think I was ever involved in a whistleblowing case that was treated in an appropriate manner. I'd just be interested to understand your findings on that.
ultimately, what we want to do is create an environment where people come forward with their concerns and not worry. I don't want them to worry about which process should they follow. We just want people to come forward. But then the reason that we have nominated officers and trained nominated officers is to help triage that concern when somebody has raised it, so that we can put it through the most appropriate process.
On that, then, from your triage system, what proportion of all reports are true whistleblowing as opposed to potential grievances?
Yeah, I don't have that information, and I think we'd have to speak to departments about whether or not they track that information.
Miss Wallington, Miss Pickles, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, so just as an example, for the last year we had 53 reported cases, which we took forward 20 as whistleblowing. The remaining cases might have been put through a different sort of process, grievance or conduct type process, or another departmental process. Some, of course, we can't take forward, particularly if they're anonymous and we don't have enough information. But lots of the cases that we don't take forward as whistleblowing are still investigated and treated formally.
Thank you. Ms Pickles?
Yes, a similar pattern. So for our cases last year, I think we had 51 cases through to that whistleblowing hotline that I mentioned earlier. 39% of those actually seemed to have a case to answer and taken through. The rest were kind of pushed into a different process, like an employee grievance or something like that, so didn't meet the bar to be counted as whistleblowing.
Thank you. I should say one of the reasons that we've got HMRC and DWP here is that they have got a number of cases they're dealing with, and that's not necessarily a sign of failure. It's that actually there's a system that picks them up. We were keen to have departments that are actually dealing with this rather than the outliers. And figure 4 is quite interesting to see. We noticed that the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency has quite a high number of whistleblowing incidents, presumably to do with health and safety. I'm going to bring in Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown and then go to Mr Grant. Sir Geoffrey.
It's good afternoon, everybody. Listening to your answers and listening to Ms Barker's excellent questions, it does seem to me that this whole process is likely to be fairly traumatic for the whistleblower. So when they go to your nominated officers and they say, right, I've reported this to my line manager, it's still very unsatisfactory, I'm thinking about going through the whistleblowing procedure, can they get confidential advice either from your ambassadors, Ms Pickles, or your nominated officers, Ms Wallington, and can they be sure that that advice is confidential? It doesn't until they decide, at the point they decide to make a whistleblowing complaint, that conversation is totally confidential.
I start.
Wallington, thank you.
Yes, so cases come in through different routes. Quite a few whistleblowing concerns do come up through the line management chain. Others come in through our in-confidence system, which is a anonymous confidential system that's picked up through our compliance team. All cases then go to HR to be triaged and investigated if that's the right
but
route
I was just
to take.
talking before we get to that stage. I've had this unsatisfactory experience. Either something that's happened in the department or something that's happened to me. I'm not sure whether I want to take it through the whistleblowing procedure or not. But I'm talking to one of your nominated officers. Hopefully, I might know that that's totally confidential until I actually press the button and say, right, I am going to take this through the whistleblowing procedure.
Yes, so they can have a completely confidential conversation with the nominated officers who they can get advice from. We also signpost people to other sources of advice, whether it's through our employee assistance programme, through the trade unions or ACAS. So we provide people with different routes to get that sort of support, but nominated officers are the key way within the department.
Yeah.
Ms Pickles, do you want to comment on that?
And within
do you have nominated officers as well as ambassadors?
Yes, we absolutely have the nominated officers who will sit within our HR casework team. So that is a confidential source of advice there for any employee wanting to take advice or seek further kind of guidance or signposting as to what they would do. Equally, as I mentioned earlier, the whistleblowing hotline sits within government internal audit, so is separate to the department. So again, they would get independent advice there. And also, as Esther pointed out, the trade unions are an important source of confidential advice and support, and we work closely with them, including working closely with them on putting bulletins out to staff. The most frequent one went out, I think it was in February this year, again, just highlighting to their members what to do if they have concerns, and that the trade union itself can be an important source of support and advice to any colleague in those circumstances, and signpost them into any of the relevant departmental procedures or processes.
Thank you very much. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. Ms Pickles, in one of your earlier answers, you mentioned an annual speak out campaign or call out campaign. Or what does that affect? Is that something that's done within your department, or does it run across the whole civil service at the same time?
Yeah, so I think it is highlighted as one of the areas of best practice, and kind of comes from the Cabinet Office as a push across all civil service departments. But it's something that DWP actively supports and takes part in. And as I said, we have a Director General champion who sits on our executive team, who's our Respect champion. They are very prominent during that week in terms of messaging to staff, speaking at events, and it's all part of the broader, shift in culture to encourage colleagues who have concerns to be able to speak up and feel that they can do so in a safe environment, and that is what we would welcome and encourage everybody working for us to do.
Thank you. Ms Ryland, as well as the role you have within the Cabinet Office itself, the Cabinet Office has a responsibility for the coordination and support of whistleblowing management across the civil service. How effective do you think the Cabinet Office is in doing that job?
Yeah, and the Cabinet Office have got a separate HR team which look after this, so a colleague of Esther and Davies. However, I do know that they have really focused, particularly through the Speak Up campaigns, on promoting speaking up and people being able to raise a complaint, advertising the number of different routes, including anonymously and confidentially. There was a number of training events run through the Speak Up Week that happened in March, targeted at line managers, but also individuals, around the different ways that different options for people in terms of raising those complaints. And I do know that they've also looked at how they manage cases so that issues raised are investigated robustly but in a timely manner.
If the Cabinet Office has been really effective in this, then examples of best practice that we've seen referred to here would be universal across the civil service. But we can see from the annual report, for example, that some departments don't have a whistleblowing helpline, or hotline, I beg your pardon, despite the fact that in departments that have got one, it's one of the most common ways that employees use to raise concerns. Is there anything that should change in your role as it refers to the rest of the civil service that would make it easier for the Cabinet Office to make sure that best practice becomes everybody's practice?
Yeah, I think there's two things I'd like to say there. The first is, I think we can always do more in terms of surfacing and sharing best practice, and I think that is definitely the role of the Cabinet Office to facilitate that, and also through our data collection to provide evidence for things that work, so that we can start to look at things like the people survey results and the number of cases to really illustrate why some things are really effective. I do think that the departments are accountable for implementing the whistleblowing policies and processes in their department, so I think our roles are right. I think there's more that we can do in terms of facilitating that sharing of best practice. I think, then my second thing that I would say is each department is really different in terms of the workforce they have and where that workforce might be based and how they work. So I think we should expect that there would be some differences in practice to account for how different the workforces are in some cases.
Thank you. You said that departments are accountable for the way they carry out those functions. Who are they accountable to? How does that accountability work? Does it just go through the Minister or the Secretary of State?
Yeah, so I think accounting officers are ultimately accountable for it. I believe that every department does report to their Audit and Risk Committee around whistleblowing and what the number of cases and what they're doing around that. So I think that's how the lines of accountability work.
Thank you. Can I come back again to Ms Pickles and Ms Wallington? What's the actual process by which you're held to account for your performance in managing the whistleblowing service?
So as Fiona's just said, exactly, we report quarterly to our audit committee and on an annual basis as well. And in DWP we also include a report within our annual report and accounts. So it is ultimately an accounting officer responsibility, but we report through that in that way.
And the same in HMRC,
Wallington,
the Audit and Risk Committee, which I attend to respond to any questions on the report that we send them, and it's in our accounts.
Is whistleblowing, for example, always included in your regular performance reviews and your setting of your own individual targets for the year? Do you always have discussions with your own line managers as to whether there's anything different needs to be done over the year?
Interesting question. I think we would think of it as a whole executive committee responsibility. So there are different sets of responsibilities to provide an excellent service to whistleblowers and people who are raising concerns of any sort, and that absolutely is a key part of my personal objectives and others, particularly where the services provided by HR. As an overall executive committee, we've done a huge amount of work in HMRC on what we call Respect at Work, which was a big report that we did on culture and behaviours in HMRC, and that was something that we very consciously owned as a total executive committee. So everybody on our executive committee will have responsibilities to maintain those behavioural standards and that culture in HMRC, and to that degree, absolutely, that would be a key part of everybody's performance expectations.
Thank you. Again, for each of you, Ms. Ryland has described the way in which departments are held to account for the kind of, I suppose, the management and encouragement of whistleblowing. Are there any improvements you think could be made to the way that you're held to account, first as individual officers and secondly as a department? Because, to be honest, it does seem to me that with the best will in the world, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Defence Secretary and so on have got a lot of things on their plate, and they're not always going to be routinely asking about whistleblowing. Is there more that could be done in accountability to make sure, for example, that departments that are not at the same standard as you are just now can be brought up to that standard quickly?
I think on the back of the NAO report there is an opportunity for us to really focus on a small number of recommendations, and I think that is something that we could consider as an HR function, how we might create some standardisation through the expectations that we set for ourselves.
And I think, as large departments, we have a responsibility in that we are better resourced sometimes and have more expertise in these areas. And so that's why it's an important part for us to be part of the network that the Cabinet Office kind of oversee and be active partners in that, so that we are supporting those smaller departments who need to learn, who may not have some of the policies that we do in place, so that they can come to us as well as the Cabinet Office for that sort of source of advice and support when they're looking to improve things in their own areas as well.
Thank you. Ms. Ryland, you said in one of your answers previously that departments should be having their whistleblowing activities reported at the Audit and Risk Committees on a regular basis. Does the Cabinet Office make sure that that's actually happening and that it's happening effectively?
Can I just ask my colleague, Matthew Thomas?
Mr. Davies.
So it's in the expectations that are set out in the model policy that should happen, and in those wider responsibilities. I know the NAO report talks about different use of information that's actually reported upwards, and that's something that we will take forward with departments to perhaps establish some more best practice in both the information that is used and the way it's reported, far more in line with what we've heard from HMRC and DWP. But beyond that, we don't take a sort of policing role in following up whether it's happened.
I mean, you used the term policing. I might refer to monitoring or coordination. Shouldn't it be part of the Cabinet Office's role to find out which departments are not doing that and to ask them to explain why not? If it's part of the model policy, if it's accepted best practice, first of all, do you know what departments currently are not complying with that best practice, and what are you doing to make sure that they comply in future?
So it is already mentioned in some of the health check elements, and also there are a couple of questions in the annual data return about the process, but it's certainly an area I think the NAO would agree as part of their recommendation 1, where we can strengthen some data to get a better picture in that area.
Thank you. We've seen the statistics in the NAO report about some departments, such as HMRC, that have a relatively high number of whistleblowing referrals, and some departments that have got very few or almost none. How confident can you be that the departments that don't have whistleblowing incidents is because there's nothing to blow the whistle on, as opposed to people either don't know how to complain or they're scared to raise it? How can you be sure that anyone who's got concerns anywhere in the civil service is actually raising them in an appropriate way?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a really good question. We try and establish that not just through the data collection, but through the health check process. And again, I would agree with the NAO recommendation about making sure that we work with departments to get more consistent data as evidence against their health check assessments in terms of that. I think some of this is difficult though, because there are more than one way. There's multiple ways in every department to raise issues. So it isn't that all of the complaints will be going through the whistleblowing process. But I do think, and I agree with the NAO on this, that we could have more consistent data around the evidence of the health check to give us that assurance and confidence.
Thank you. Currently, about half of all civil servants in the UK don't feel that it's safe for them to challenge the way things are done. Do you in your role have a personal objective to increase that by a particular amount over the next 2 years, 5 years, whatever?
Yeah, that is definitely something that we need to work on across the civil service. It has improved over recent people surveys, but it's not where we want it to be. In terms of my role, I do feel I've got a responsibility in terms of the model policy, the tools that we provide to departments, and more importantly, that sharing of best practice. So where are departments doing it really well, and can we encourage that across the other departments? So that is definitely an area where we need to work on, and that's further demonstrated through, I think, just under half of our whistleblowers come forward anonymously.
Yeah. Again, you referred to what the Cabinet Office does in terms of promoting best practice and encouraging and so on. Isn't there still a gap, though, that nobody appears to be accountable for the fact that half of the civil service doesn't feel confident despite the best efforts of everyone here? Who should be held to account for that statistic? Whose job is it, out of the thousands of civil servants we have, to say, I'm going to make sure that in 5 years' time 3/4 of civil servants feel comfortable about raising concerns, or 60%, or whatever the figure might be?
Yeah, I mean, I feel it's the responsibility of the accounting officers in each department and agency to make sure that that is the environment in their own departments. I do feel that there is a role and responsibility for me in making sure that departments have consistent tools, and that we can use the data and evidence that we've got to really understand what works and what doesn't, to support departments in that.
Thank you.
Can I just chip in? And what do you think should happen if people are not doing that? Because as Mr. Grant highlighted, some departments always feel very busy with their very important things that they've got to do. Whether it's national security or defending the nation, or they've always, so the culture of different departments is quite different sometimes. How do you make sure that an accounting officer is doing what they should be doing on whistleblowing? It's hard for you to do that when they've got their big department that they're in.
I mean, in my experience, the accounting officers do feel that is their accountability and are working on in terms of this. I mean, you referenced before, it is a really big thing to raise a complaint within an organisation. So whilst there's definitely more there is definitely more that we can do in terms of that. But I think that accounting officers need to be, do feel that responsibility, and that audit and risk committees need to ensure that they have the right processes in place to discharge that accountability.
Okay, well, we can hold them to account every time they come in front of us. Mr. Grant, back to you.
Thank you, Chair. I've certainly found since I came on to the Public Accounts Committee, and expect other members have, that we quite regularly have people contacting us with what they see as whistleblowing concerns, and in my experience certainly about half of them are on issues that are not covered under the Public Interest Disclosure Act. Some of them would probably not be regarded as whistleblowing within a departmental practice. What more can we do to make sure that people understand, first of all, how to go about raising a concern, and second, that they understand what kinds of concerns should be raised in different ways?
Yeah, I think we've worked, we've done a lot of work in terms of the model policy to make sure that people understand who it covers. So, for example, the whistleblowing policy covers more than just existing civil servants, so people that have left the civil service or people that are workers, on temporary contracts or things like that can raise complaints. So we've done a lot of work in terms of the actual policy to help people understand. But as I said before, if people have got a concern, I'd rather that they just came forward, whether it's their line manager or a nominated officer, another senior manager in the organisation, and not worry too much about how do I classify this issue or concern or what process should I follow. I would rather we encourage people to come forward, and then we would help take that through the right process. But there is in the model policy, there is advice and guidance about what constitutes a whistleblowing complaint.
Again, my question is, how do we make sure that everybody understands what the process is, and how do we, for example, how often do individual civil servants get reminded this is what to do if you see something that's not right, this is how you go about it? I mean, you can't go on a tube train without being told what to do if you see somebody being harassed.
No,
do you have similar notices around civil service offices?
I completely agree. And departments do this through the information that they put on the intranet, information that they share it in terms of town halls. I've seen examples of kind of blogs, intranet articles that do that. The Civil Service Code, for example, is covered in our new Civil Service induction. So, again, I think that's a role that we can play in terms of collating all the different ways that departments are doing that and share it back out in terms of what departments can do more of. But I have seen lots of evidence of departments really publicising how people can raise issues and concerns in their department.
Do you feel that everyone in the civil service is sufficiently aware of the ways that they can actively support a colleague who has raised a concern? And equally important, is everyone aware of the kinds of behaviour that would be classified as unfair treatment? It's not just about someone being sacked or disciplined or passed over for promotion. If they start to be given less popular duties by the line manager, if they start being at the end of the queue applying for holidays, and if they just start, people don't talk to them in the coffee room, all of those are actually unlawful mistreatment of a whistleblower. How confident can we be that everyone in the civil service understands that that is the standard of support that they're entitled to if they do decide to raise a complaint, and equally that that's a standard of support that they're required to give to colleagues who do the same? I
think that's a really good point, and I think there probably is more that we can do around that, and I think we in the Cabinet Office can work with departments in terms of what training and awareness do they already run that again we can share, and actually what do we need to do in terms of our central training offer that would support that. For example, I do know that the Cabinet Office runs some training for the workforce in terms of those kind of issues, so I think there's more that we can do to ensure that that is happening consistently across the civil service.
Thanks. And finally from me for just now, Ms Barker mentioned earlier on that she was involved in trade union activities for a long time, and she's gone on the record as saying that every whistleblowing case that she represented was wrongly handled. What do the civil service trade unions
just to be clear, Ms Barker wasn't working with the civil service.
No, yeah.
Just before everyone in the room just puts their heads in their hands in despair. Mr Grant.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. If you asked civil service unions the same question, what would they say?
Well, I haven't asked them that question directly, but we have engaged a lot on the topic. So, for example, before the model policy had been issued, there were full engagement with NTUC colleagues.
Sorry, I'm talking now about what happens rather than what the policy says should happen. Have any of your departments actually said to your trade union representatives, how do you think your members are treated by us when they raise whistleblowing concerns? Is that something that you make a point of asking trade unions? I see Ms Wallington is nodding. Is that something
let's go to the departments.
I mean, we have regular dialogue with the trade unions, and this is one theme of conversation, not just on whistleblowing, but anybody that raises concerns of any sort is an area of conversation both at whole organisational level and within business groups with the trade unions.
And similarly, as I referred to earlier, we work closely with the trade unions to make sure that all of our policies and advice to staff are clear and that people understand them and the signposting's right. We work with them in terms of their own bulletins, as I referred to the one that recently went out to members of the PCS within DWP. Again, reinforcing the support available, the signposting that's there, the policy that's there to protect their members and employees within the department. So I am sure, as I say, in those regular conversations, if they had concerns that people were not being treated appropriately or the policies not being followed, that would be raised with us. I'm not aware that that's been behind any of the recent communication that we've done. That's just part of the good practice and the ongoing dialogue we have with them about a range of issues.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for now, Mr. Ryland. Paula Barker, MB.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Ryland, can I just come back on something Mr. Grant was talking about as well? And we know from the NAO report that whistleblowing should be used to support organisational learning and improvement. And you yourself said that you agree with the NAO report and that you could have more consistent data. You went on to say that consistent tools are needed to understand the data collected to then go on to improve departments. But yet, in respect of the health check framework, there's no review of completed returns from departments, and there's no central data analysis which could then be used to share insights and encourage learning. So why is that not being done?
Yeah, so I think what we do is an analysis of the annual data collection. I might hand over to my colleague Matthew in a moment. I think in terms of the health check, we do follow up with departments around their returns. I think our opportunity here is, because departments use data in different ways to support that health check, is to provide more guidance and dialogue with departments around the data that they're using in terms of the evidence. But maybe
so just to build on that information, so the health check is a tool for departments to use in among a number of other devices they may have, and others may want to come into comment to do a check across their raising a concern policies. Separate to that, but also with some overlapping categories, we have the annual data return. We do carry out analysis across a series of both quantitative and qualitative questions, and that is formulated into a report that gets sent out. And we've been doing that since 2017, and that is sent back out to HR directors, nominated officers and policy leads, so they can see the bigger picture about raising a concern and draw any inferences they might do for their own improvement. So while not disagreeing with what the NEA has said at all, there are things for different purposes. So the health check is that tool, and the data that we ask for is we see a great level of compliance with.
It just poses the question, I suppose, about why is there not one consistent policy that all departments can use with the same set of metrics in terms of data collection, etc., the same analysis? Because with respect, we're hearing, well, everything is very complex and, you know, data's collected differently and this is different. I don't think it's that complex, if I'm honest. And I think that, you know, regardless of different policies, procedures, regardless of different data collection methods, it could be done far easier if there was a will to. So the question is, why is there not a will to? Because you yourself, Ms. Ryland, has said that it can be used, good data can be used to improve departments. And you've also agreed with the NAO on the lack of the consistency of data. So why is everyone sitting there saying, well, it's far too complex? Why is people not making it easier?
No, I do think we can make improvements in terms of this. So I just want to make a distinction. The annual data collection is consistent data that departments return in the same way. The data that they use to assess their performance against the health check, that's where there's an inconsistency in terms of data. I do think there's more that we can do with departments to understand why is that data consistent, and is there a way that we can be more consistent in terms of that use of data? So I don't think it's too hard. I think we need to do that work.
So for clarity, when you say more can be done, be specific, what more can be done?
So what we're planning to do is provide more guidance and training for departments that are completing those health checks. I also think we need to get some feedback from departments around their use of data as to understand some of the underlying reasons for that inconsistency. So is it that the data isn't available and we can, departments can do something different to make that data available, or is it just their approach to the health check? So I think we can provide the training and the guidance, and that we can understand from departments why there's a difference or inconsistency in that data.
You said that's being planned. What's the timeline for that,
Yeah.
please?
We will do it for the next data collection. So that will be... we normally write out about this time, actually, for the data collection. So, we'll make changes to the next data
I think
collection.
in reference to some of what Ms Barker's raising, figure 2 is quite useful in that outlining actions that have taken place since we last reported on this. And so there are still gaps there, but it shows where some of the progress is in theory. Yeah. But I think, as Ms Barker's highlighted, and we've seen agreement from some witnesses, not all yet perfect. Ms Barker, did you have one?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
Chair.
you for now, Ms Barker. to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Deputy Chair.
So, Miss Ryland, just to zero in a little bit on some of Miss Barker's questions, and taking you to figure 4, using all that data and the health checks, it always worries me when I see a table like this and there's a significant outlier. Why is the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office such an outlier when it's a relatively small department, certainly a lot smaller than the two other departments we've got represented here, DWP and HMRC? Why is FCDO such an outlier?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is I think the numbers are relatively small in terms of the whistleblowing complaints versus the number of people that we have across the civil service. So I think to draw out...
Just on that point, figure 5 is useful in respect of the numbers in total.
No, well, I accept that.
Yeah, I just think for anyone following...
They are a small department.
For anyone following, the figures of numbers are on
yeah, so I think sometimes it's difficult to draw that kind of inference because we are talking about quite small numbers versus quite large numbers of employees. I don't have specific details of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office issues that have been raised.
Yes. Okay. Perhaps I can turn to the other two departments, Miss Wallington and Miss Pickles. Going to the bottom of that table, that's the other organisations employing civil servants, arms length bodies, and so on. Again, there seems to be huge variation in that. So, what are you both doing to ensure that all of those other bodies under your department's control are fully aware of the whistleblowing implications?
I think in that list, I'm not sure that any are under these two departments.
No, I think not. But you did. One of you referred earlier in this hearing to your arm's length bodies. So what was Miss Pickles? Thank you, Chair. What steps are you doing to make sure that your arm's length bodies are fully aware of all the implications of this?
So we work closely with our arm's length bodies to make sure that they're aware of they certainly do the annual data return to the Cabinet Office. So actually the reason they don't appear is because they haven't had any whistleblowing cases. But as I said earlier, in terms of learning and continuous improvement and picking up on the NAO report and the recommendations in that, we've just recently written to our ALBs to ensure that they are now in future going to complete the annual health check, and the improvements that colleagues from the Cabinet Office have referred to in that will help us work with them and, as I said earlier, provide them with support and guidance if they need it from ourselves as a large department in terms of improvements they need to make to their own processes and policies.
I can't actually think what your arm's length bodies are, but there must be some.
We have Valuation Office Agency,
yes.
And we're very tightly connected with the agency. The Chief Executive sits on our Executive Committee, so we work really closely on whistleblowing, and the Chief Executive will be held to the same behaviour and organisational standards and expectations as all others in HMRC.
Ms Ryland, not these two departments, but all the other departments, when you have discussions with the lead departments, do you also then start to think about their arm's length bodies and other organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another area that in the NAO report they said that the way that arm's length bodies were included in the health check varied by department. So we are talking to departments about how they ensure that arm's length bodies are covered by the policy and particularly by the health check. I do think the nature of the relationship between ALBs and departments varies by those ALBs and departments, but we are working towards understanding how departments can be more consistent in how they account for whistleblowing in their ALBs.
Thank you very much. I mean, talking about consistency, why is it necessary for any department to tailor their policies? Why isn't there just one policy across the civil service?
I think that's because it varies in terms of the nature of the business of the departments and the type of workforce that they have, and so I mean, I don't know whether any of my colleagues would want to elaborate on that.
I mean, we use the Cabinet Office model policy, but our policy refers, for example, to procedures that are relevant within HMRC. So, for example, raising concerns through the incompetence system, which is an HMRC system we use. The employee advice service, where complaints are handled at the outset. That's specific to HMRC. So, the core of the policy is the same, but through the policy we'll refer to specific processes that are departmental.
Doesn't that cause confusion? I mean, we see in this committee people who come before us have moved from several different departments in quite a short space of time. If each department's got its own different policies, doesn't that cause confusion?
The expectations of the policy are the same. People want to know through the single document how to raise concerns in their organisation, and some of those are necessarily different. For example, in HMRC, probably similarly to DWP, we have a particular body that looks at fraud. They look at customer fraud as well as internal fraud within the organisation. That's not the sort of organisation that might exist within some of the other government departments. So that's the sort of area where the procedures might be slightly different across government departments.
Ms Pickles, how does your department, DWP, how does it vary?
Yeah, so in a very similar way, the policy would be broadly the same. It's in some of those details around the procedures. So, for example, the ability within DWP to call the government internal audit officers as the hotline, that's the point of contact, as well as nominated officers, and then just some of the specific examples to help colleagues actually navigate the policy, and to the point we were talking about earlier, to actually understand what constitutes whistleblowing in the context of the department and the work that colleagues are doing, versus other routes that might be more appropriate where they've identified fraud in the benefits system. There's a different approach for that. Where it may still be covered by whistleblowing and therefore be appropriate to do that, but there's lots of other processes, and if you've got a security concern, for example, there would be another route to raise that. So it's more around trying to ensure that colleagues really understand what is whistleblowing in this context. Is this the right policy for that, or should they be signposted elsewhere, rather than the substance of the policy itself? It's more around that guidance and the procedures that sit around it.
I'm slightly struggling by that answer. If I was working in your department and I came across fraud, I'd take that to my line manager and I would expect that to be dealt with. I suppose it's only in the case where the line manager doesn't deal with it, but I thought the whole ethos of the department would be wanting to try and eliminate fraud, so everybody would be ultra keen to try and investigate rather than needing to be a whistleblower in fraud cases.
Absolutely, and all colleagues now go through mandatory fraud and error training on an annual basis in the department. That is separate to whistleblowing. It's not referred to as whistleblowing. That's all about what to do. As you say, absolutely raise it with your line manager if you don't feel able to do that. There are different routes within the department to be able to route that. So actually, where we're talking about whistleblowing, if you look at the examples, I've just found them in my notes here in the department. That's things, so we give examples around falsifying expense claims or fixing a contract for personal gain. So it is not about necessarily identifying fraud and error in the benefit system. That would be a different thing that, we would hope that their annual training, which they get, as I say, on an annual basis, but also it's a very important part of our induction training as well. Colleagues would already know what to do in those circumstances. This is for kind of things that fall outside of that process that they would have already known about.
So, just to try and tease this out a little bit, and then I'm going to hand back to the chair. But while you're on your feet, as it were, Ms Pickles, have you? I mean, in the last year, have you any cases of whistleblowing involving fraud?
Hang on, let me just double check my numbers. No. Not in the past year.
We've had one case of fraud, but they're quite rare. In the report, you'll see that quite a lot of whistleblowing cases across the civil service are fraud-related, but actually in our department, they're a very small proportion of whistleblowing cases. For the same reasons as DWP, we have, it's part of people's induction, it's part of their annual training, it's absolutely central to our standards of conduct, and we've got very established ways for people to report concerns that they might have about fraud. Also, our systems are set up to identify risk within the system. So the numbers tend to be very small for us.
You may decline to answer this question. This is totally acceptable if you decline to answer it. I'm certainly not wanting a name, but are you able to give us the basis of that one fraud case?
I don't have the data, I don't have the information on the case, and I think it would be identifiable.
We wouldn't want to identify anybody. No.
May I just come back in, because I've just re-looked at my table. We had one case of fraud reported, referred to our whistleblowing hotline, but there was found to be no case to answer, so it wasn't proceeded as such. So it was assessed as not meeting the bar or not being an appropriate referral.
It's whistleblowing, but it may have got dealt with through another route.
No, that would have been there would be no case to answer.
Case at all.
Yes, so it didn't go forward.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just before we move on from arm's length bodies, we noticed, of course, in this chart on figure 4, the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency and has had more whistleblowing concerns raised. Presumably, that's partly because it's to do with health and safety, and as a culture in the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency that you do report
I would agree with that. But also, and it's in the NAO best practice report, they do a lot of training that's targeted at specific job roles in terms of how they raise issues and. Yeah, so I think they've also done a lot of training and raising awareness around that, but they have got a strong health and safety culture.
It's interesting, when the committee visited Washington DC and we met with NASA, and their whistleblowing approach is very interesting, and I think lessons to be learned there across the board about how they...
If I may, I also think there's lessons to be learned around good health and safety often involves reporting near misses. And I think,
exactly.
And I do think there is something in terms of, in terms of whistleblowing or just raising concerns around, when things are early or small, please, we still want to know about.
Do you think that there's lessons learned there from those frontline organisations that are literally dealing with life and death that could be perhaps replicated in departments where people are at desks and it's not so immediately... Now, how are you looking to try and promulgate that approach then?
Yeah, well, we'll pick that up through the review that we do of sharing of best practice.
Okay, so well, we can. I just wanted to. We noticed that the cabinet, the Department for Business and Trade, is reviewing its whistleblowing framework. Is there any update you've got on that, Mr. Davies? And what do you think? What do you think? Can you give us talk us through how that's going and whether it will actually improve whistleblowing and what they're going through to do that?
Well, I think they're still completing their review and going through that. So we haven't had, as a set of employers, the civil service haven't really had much engagement yet, but we are in touch with the team that are putting through that policy. We've got to get the balance right between not overstepping the mark as employers with that review. We will, of course, respond to that review as soon as that comes through. I think broadly we welcome the review as we do sort of examination of our own, and we'll wait and see how that changes the sort of framework we need to work within.
Yeah, and obviously, when it's to do with trade, you've got quite a lot of moving parts there, potentially for fraud. So I guess that will be looking closely at that and international matters. So it'll be quite an interesting department review, really.
No, I think they're doing the review. They hold the whistleblowing framework for GB.
Sorry, forgive me. What they do?
Yeah.
Sorry,
it's across all sectors, and they're doing it as their kind of main.
Forgive me. Sorry, okay. And I just wanted to go back to the data stuff. We've obviously talked a bit about that, but one of the things that was really apparent from the report is that the case tracking leaves a bit to be desired. So if you take the point of start and the point of finish, sometimes things can go on for a long time, and it seems that they can get lost track of, and therefore you can't easily measure how long it's taking. And if we go back to that issue of the poor whistleblower in the middle of it, or indeed the department being investigated, it can be quite challenging. So how are you going to improve that case tracking, Ms. Ryland, across the board? And maybe we'll get examples from the department.
Yeah, so from a Cabinet Office perspective, we've picked that up from the NAO report, which is the next time we collect data, we're going to make sure we pick up cases that were outstanding at the previous data collection, if that makes sense, so that we do track it end to end. So from a Cabinet Office perspective, we're just going to make sure that we do that in terms of the data collection.
Okay, so but you're collecting in DWP and HMRC, you're doing that. So you can tell us how many ongoing cases you've got now, for example. Yep. We don't want to put you on the spot necessarily. I mean, you could tell us if,
Yeah.
Okay. And do you know how long the longest are taking, and whether there's problems that some are taking too long compared with others? Do you keep a track of that, Ms. Pickles and then Ms. Wallington?
Yeah, so we know what the kind of the average is around 2 to 3 months for a case, but in very complex cases, some have gone as long as a year. That's not ideal under any circumstances, but sometimes these are quite complicated things.
We've seen longer in one department, which we can't mention here, but
we do track them in conjunction with government internal
so 2 to 3 months is what you would expect.
That was the average, we would say,
average.
yes.
Okay, Ms. Wallington.
Over half of ours over the last year were completed within 6 months. I don't have the breakdown below that, and the majority of the others were completed within 7 to 12 months. We have got 2 over the year that took longer than 12 months, where they were particularly complex. We do know this is a really important aspect of investigating concerns, because this is, we understand it's really important to whistleblowers that we investigate as quickly as possible. So this is something we're always monitoring.
It's difficult for you perhaps in public to talk about why some might be more complex than others. Is there anything like you can shed for us on that, about why something might take longer? Presumably it's got some technical element to it that you've got to apply certain expertise to.
Some might be particularly technical. The other sorts of things are sickness absence, or people out of the office.
So sometimes just as simple as that.
Can be hard to contact people to ask further questions, for example. That's the sort of thing that can delay cases.
Okay, Ms. Pickles.
I would agree. Sickness absence is invariably the sort of overwhelming reason why things take longer than anybody would ideally want.
I just want to figure. Sorry, figure 2 here. Sorry, Sir Geoffrey here.
Miss Ryland, can I carry on from my questions about fraud? We've heard from both DWP and HMRC, if I refer to you in that sense, Miss Wallington and Miss Pickles. But we do know from the NA report that 40%, I refer to figure 5, of all cases concern fraud. Why is there such a difference? It's very low in these 2 departments, and they are 2 departments that you'd expect to be dealing with quite a lot of fraud. Why is 40% of all cases, other cases presumably, because theirs is so low, of other departments, so much concerned with fraud?
Yeah, I think one reason could be that DWP and HMRC have got well-established other routes for reporting fraud. Whereas in other departments, more of these kind of cases would go through the whistleblowing route.
That must mean there's an awful lot of cases in other departments that do involve fraud. And I mean, back to the questioning that I asked both Miss Pickles and Miss Wallington, it must be so much in the interest of the department concerned to eliminate fraud, and whether these cases are truly whistleblowing cases or whether they should be dealt with under other procedures. Has the Cabinet Office looked at that?
Yeah, no, we haven't looked for that. So the data that we collect tells us that 40% of the cases are fraud. We don't have any other level of detail around the nature of those cases, kind of below that categorisation.
Now that's come into such sort of sharp contrast. Do you think that's an area you should be looking at?
I think this is an area we can follow up on. I think we can talk to departments about what information and data do they track. I think we could also talk to the Public Sector Fraud Authority about the data that they already collect in this area, just so that we don't duplicate that as well.
It seems to me that it may well be that these cases are coming up under whistleblowing, but they perhaps should not. Perhaps there should be other procedures in those departments to deal with them.
Yeah, understood.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thanks, Chair. You mentioned earlier on, and I think that the Chair asked questions particularly about cases that take a long time to bring to completion. Can I ask each of you, what are you able to do to support the whistleblower if there's a case that seems to go on for a long time? Obviously you're limited to what you can tell them, but what processes do you have in place to make sure that the whistleblower is at least kept assured that something has been done about the complaint?
And this is a really important role of the nominated officer, and it's anybody who raises a concern will be given a nominated officer who will be their sort of key point of contact, and that nominated officer works with our HR function to make sure they've got they understand exactly what's happening on the investigation. They will know potentially a little bit more information than we would share with the whistleblower about specific details of what's happening within the case, but they can provide that reassurance and they can also provide that support. And for the whistleblower, the nominated officer can address any concerns that the whistleblower might have by bringing issues back to HR or the line manager and make sure things are dealt with. So they will have a regular route to find out what's happening with the concern that they've raised and where it is in the investigation.
Thank you. Did LDP similar?
It would be a very, very similar and dealt with very much on a case-by-case basis, depending on the needs of the individual and the circumstances that were being investigated.
Thank you. Ms Ryland, do you know whether those practices are universal in other departments? Is that something you would ask them about?
Yeah, it's included in the health check. I'll just check
yes,
with my colleague.
it is, yes. So it is replicated with the nominated officers. There's also other routes for support, more based around wellbeing support, through employee assistance provision, etc. So there's a range of different sources of support that people can get and draw down from, but it's principally the nominated officer route.
I appreciate that there will be times when the well-being of the whistleblower is a significant concern, but isn't there a danger that the whistleblower then starts to feel as if they're the problem because they're the one that's being offered the support? In my own experience, I've seen it happening in both ways. I've known places where anyone who raised a concern was immediately referred to occupational health because there was an inbuilt assumption there's something wrong with them rather than there's something wrong with the organisation. So how do you find the balance between offering the support that's needed but not making somebody feel as if they've been treated like the problem rather than part of the solution?
I think because we offer such a range of options covering different sorts of support, and the first sort of thing that's offered isn't wellbeing support, but it's reasonably well advertised. There'd also be triage on the start of any wellbeing support supplied through occupational health to see if that was appropriate too.
And if I could add, I think this is an example of where we need to be led by the individual. So what support does the individual say that they need? And we work with that. I also think it's why the feedback around understanding the whistleblowing experience is so important and why we'll be taking that forward.
Thank you very much, Mr Grant. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Yes, Ms Ryland. Back in 2015, the Cabinet Office told us that it was going to start collecting data to drive improvements in the department. Why has there been such slow progress on this?
Well, I think we have implemented the annual data collection, so we've got a much better idea of the number of whistleblowing cases, the nature of those, the outcomes, the time taken. So I do think we have made progress in terms of that. We've covered it before. I do think there is more that we can do around the consistency of data in the health check process, but I think in terms of that data collection, I think we have made progress. I do agree, though, that we should ask departments around any cases of victimisation or harassment and also understand the whistleblowing experience more.
So there does seem to be, and maybe I'm wrong in this, a difference in the data that some departments produce better data than others. So what are you doing to chase up those that are not producing good data?
Again, I think that's more in the health check space. I think in terms of our annual data collection, we get consistent data from departments. I think when it comes to the health check and the data that departments use to evidence their compliance against best practice, I do think we need to work with departments to understand why there's such a variation in the data they use.
Really helpful. And now the report refers to the fact that each department's annual report and accounts has to have a section on whistleblowing, but I gather that the numbers in those annual report and accounts are only completed cases, not ongoing cases. Is there a danger that those ongoing cases get sort of dropped through the cracks, or are they always reported when they are resolved one way or another in the following years?
It's going to change, as you said.
I think
going forward,
the data that we collect, we definitely need to make sure that there's no gaps. I don't know in terms of the department data.
Our data would be picked up in the following annual report and accounts for when the case is completed, so we wouldn't miss any cases.
And Ms Pickles?
I don't know whether it would be picked up in our annual report and accounts, but we do track through, and we would welcome kind of consistent. So we know that at that point at which we report to the Cabinet Office, if it was 50 cases, it was 50. But if we had another 25 that hadn't yet reached completion, we track those through internally through to make sure that they are completed and go through. I think they would be picked up in next year, but I'm not 100% confident of that.
Just to be clear, just to walk us through it, so it's because if you've got 50 cases that are resolved in a year, you may have 25 new ones, and then they will be completed whenever they're completed. What information are you putting through to the Cabinet Office? So the completed ones or the 25 new ones as well? I mean, how do you
I think we report at the point in time along with what the Cabinet Office require us to do so. That doesn't require us to report on cases that are ongoing, is my understanding at that point in time.
Not yet, but it's coming.
So, and that's the point at which we would welcome clarity and consistency then in terms of how they get picked up in the following year, because I think at the moment there's potentially some choice. I can't honestly say how that is picked up.
I don't think because no one's trying to game a system here to say I've got more or fewer cases, but it does mean there could be confusion and double counting at the moment. That's
potentially, I think that's.
Could I, Chair, with your indulgence, could I bring the CNAG in here and ask what your auditing procedures are in relating to whistleblowing cases in the annual report and accounts, and whether you think there is a danger that in some departments they could fall between the cracks between completed and uncompleted cases?
Yeah, I mean the audit team. This is a piece of data we'd always check in the disclosures in the accounts. The basis of that is completed cases, as we've just discussed. So that's we check that the data backs that up. Obviously that presents you the problem of reconciling the data we've just been looking at and that's set out in our report on the overall system, which is not just completed cases, as I understand it. So you won't be able to read straight across from one to the other. But it's an area of data that's covered by our audit procedures at the year end.
Is there a danger that some uncompleted cases could fall through the cracks, in fact never be completed?
Well, provided that the case management system is working properly, then that shouldn't happen. But we do check every year that that's backed up by the source data. So I think that risk is reasonably low.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. Paula Barker, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Ryland, is the information and the data that you receive in line with your department's expectations? Because I'm just conscious that there's a lack of qualitative and sometimes quantitative information that you receive. So I'm just wondering how that marries up to your expectations.
Yeah, so in terms of the annual data collection, that is in line because departments comply with what we ask them to provide. Based on the NAO recommendations, we are going to review that because we are going to implement their recommendations. So yes, in terms of that annual data collection, that is in line.
So you're going to actually take on the recommendations, so that will be with immediate effect, I assume?
Yeah, from the next data collection.
Yeah.
I'm just sorry, just to remind me, I should have made a note of that, but what's the period of the next data collection, Mr Davies?
So we're preparing that to send it out. I think it goes out in the next couple of months, but I'll have to double check the date for you. But we just need a bit of time to do that. The bit that might be slightly need a bit more thought is just thinking a bit more deeply about whistleblower experience and following up with that. So I think there's some really helpful, more quantitative type data that we can now include because they're things like the case length, etc., that are more straightforward. I think where we're thinking about whistleblower experience, you want to do that in a way that doesn't deter, doesn't almost have a perverse effect of deterrence. So we've got to think a little bit more carefully about how we do that, and obviously do that across a space where we have some people's names or details and a lot of anonymous as well. So I think we need to work very closely with the great experience that there is in departments to think about that set of issues together.
Ms Ryland, you referred to the health check on a number of occasions, saying that that's captured in the health check data, this is not captured over there. Is the health check confusing things, do you think, or does it enhance the experience overall, in your view?
I think, and of course we can ask our departments for feedback as well. I think that the health check is a really important tool for departments to understand where they are against the best practice and the tools that we provide. I think the inconsistencies in data use don't confuse the department, but it does sometimes doesn't help us understand the way in which the health check is being used and what trends that we can take out of the health check. So I think it's useful for departments. They use it in the way that is helpful to them. But I think if we want to try and take trends out of what does the health check tell us across the departments, that's where we need to work with departments on more consistent use of data.
We've heard a lot about employees and Mr Grant was talking about experiences, etc. And we know, for example, if you leave an organisation, you will often have an exit interview to capture your experiences, reasons why you're leaving, etc. Is there any interviews undertaken with the whistleblower, for example, about their experience to capture that experience and that qualitative data?
I'm not aware that that's what we do at the moment. I think we do need to think carefully about how we capture whistleblowers' experience for the point that my colleague made, which is I don't want to create more barriers for whistleblowers to come forward, but I am really interested in what the experience of whistleblowers is, and we do have to find ways of capturing it from people that have come forward anonymously.
So you don't do that, but what about the two?
I was just going to ask, Ms Pickles, Ms Wallington, do you?
So we don't, and this is something that has very helpfully come out of the report, we don't at the moment ask whistleblowers to fill in a survey, for example, to explain their experiences. They do discuss their experiences with the nominated officer. If there are particular issues, that would be captured within the team, but not in a way that we could draw out and then report on. So I think there is a really great opportunity in my team working with the Cabinet Office on how we might get better at capturing that information in a way that can be used to compare experiences across departments and learn from best practice on that. Mm-hmm. But we do know quite a bit about the experience through the nominated officers, and so we have a feel for it, but we can't draw out sort of comparable specific data points on it.
And just on that, you know quite a bit, you said, from the officers. So would you say that in the main that whistleblowers are content, happy, dissatisfied with the process from the data that you've got?
So the people that, so we find out a lot through the nominated officers who compare information with one another and share not individual data but share themes, and we can draw out some themes from that. So for example, whether it's at the end of a case or whether it's during a case, we can draw out some of the learnings and that's then fed back into the team. For whistleblowers who are anonymous, we find it much harder to collect information. We can have some dialogue with the individuals through our in-confidence system, but it's quite limited. And so that's an area for us to do a bit more work on.
Any questions to Ms Pickles?
So it was something that our Audit, Risk and Assurance Committee pulled out when we reported to them in February that they wanted us to do more on this. So we are actively working and in March wrote out to other government departments asking what they did in this space to look at the experience of whistleblowers. So it's something we're actively working on. But at the moment, no, we don't capture that detail, and particularly thinking about how we might do that, as Esther said, for anonymous whistleblowers is particularly tricky. But it's something we're actively looking to put in place as soon as we possibly can, because we recognise it's a gap.
Ms Wallington, you raised an interesting point about drawing out some of the data and using it for a learning experience, for example. But I noticed from the report that whilst there is some evidence of civil service organisations learning from concerns, the numbers are very low. With 21% of concerns finding wrongdoing and leading to changes in policies and procedures, and only just on 5% of all completed concerns led to changes of policies and procedures. And I know, Mr Ryland, you spoke earlier about it's not always relevant to change policies and procedures, for example. Ms Wallington, I'd be keen to understand from your perspective, as you've specifically reference learning points. What sort of learning do you gain, and then how is that then mirrored in the department, or how is that utilised in the department?
I don't want to cut across or hurry people along too much, but we might have a vote as early as 3, so... Okay. Clipped answers, helpful. Yeah. Thank you, Ms Wallington. You've been very good so far, but just...
The numbers are very small, so they tend to be quite individual cases, but sometimes there can be some general themes, so we tend to have slightly more whistleblowing numbers in how the department, how line managers operate the recruitment procedures. So while the outcome of those sorts of cases wouldn't necessarily change departmental policy relating to recruitment, it might change the way we train managers, or there might be something really specific within a team that would mean that we wanted to either train people or change local procedures in response to a whistleblowing concern. So that's the sort of thing that happens with the cases. Some cases lead to different sorts of processes, so conduct type processes might be another outcome. So it's largely speaking, it would be very local responses to whistleblowing concerns, which is why the numbers are quite small in terms of major departmental policy changes.
And then I think finally from me, I personally think it's really, really important for employees of organisations, whether it be a government department or whether it be an arm's length body, for example, has that confidence to be able to come forward and have their concerns addressed, and for organisations to learn from that. I was interested that you used the word barriers, Ms Ryland, when you spoke about understanding whistleblowers' experience and saying that you don't want to put further barriers in the way. I found that really interesting, because I think the more support that you give to a whistleblower, to know that they are being listened to, that their concerns are being treated seriously, that you are actively seeking their information. I'm interested why you would believe that to be a barrier.
No, I don't think the process of getting somebody's feedback is a barrier. Maybe the method that you choose to do that. So, for example, people may not want to be interviewed. So maybe it was a reaction to, so I just think we need, as well as understand it, as well as making sure that we understand whistleblowers' experience, I think we need to do that in a way that makes whistleblowers feel comfortable and listened to, and not another step in the process.
So how can we be confident that organisations are actually learning, and the government indeed is learning from concerns raised? How can the committee be confident that is all in place and will be taken forward?
Yeah, so we agree with the recommendation of the NAO about putting in place a process for collecting whistleblowers' experiences and feedback, and we will work with departments to make sure that that's in place.
Thank you very much, Ms Barker. Sir Geoffrey, Deputy Chair.
I'll just ask you, really, probably two things that are not in the report. How does the Single Source Regulations Office interact with all of this? This is for people in the private sector and public sector to be able to make a public sector declaration to people, nominated people, but outside their department, for example, the NAO. Have you any experience of how that works?
I don't think we have. I'll have to think about and come back to you, I'm afraid.
Thank you for that answer, because that brings me to the next question. Some of this whistleblowing procedure is very complex and it's very legal, and people who don't make the necessary public interest disclosure under the Public Interest and Disclosure Act don't have protection under the Act and have, in some cases, lost their job. So I wonder whether there is a case for a fairly complex and comprehensive document being prepared by somebody, presumably your department, Ms Ryland, setting out exactly what a whistleblower's protections and obligations are.
Or a flowchart, I think was what.
Or even a flowchart, but something that's... of course they would get this information, presumably, hopefully, if you're well-trained nominated officers. But actually, before they got to that stage, if I was sort of sitting at home wondering whether I was going to make a whistleblowing complaint, I might like to actually quite look at a document and see how my case fitted into the whole system.
Yeah, we can take that away.
So our model guidance already sets out the types of disclosure that are covered in the Public Interest Disclosure Act, and I think it's very readily available information on intranets. So I think there is that kind of almost that self-assessment piece that you're talking about is very readily available to civil servants.
What Sir Geoffrey's partly driving at is that it's going to even a nominated officer, even someone in a trusted system. It's quite a big step.
Yes.
Whereas the National Audit Office is there one step removed. There are, in fact, I think people can come to MPs. We have limits what we can do with it. But that can feel more comfortable for some people because it's a big issue, big thing to be a whistleblower.
It is, and we do make it very clear that there's prescribed person and the type of whistleblowing concern that is very clearly rooted for
outside
people.
of the civil service.
Yes, so those prescribed people.
Where is that information?
So that's within the guidance that supports the model policy, and I imagine it's on every employer's internet.
I got this document off the internet this afternoon, but I'm just wondering how
many people read it.
I was looking for it, so I knew what I was looking for. Whether if I was just an ordinary civil servant, I mean, and after all, whistleblowing cases like to be once in a lifetime, hopefully never. Whether there's a readily available source of information on this subject.
Well, there is a guide as part of the model policy products, which should and departments will have their own versions of it, but will be readily available for people on the internet. So if you are raising a concern, there is a guide, very straightforwardly written for you, available.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the, Ms. Barker was talking, and others have talked about lessons being learned to support whistleblowers, but only 4.9% of concerns led to actually changes of policies or procedures. I'd be interested to hear from Ms. Pickles and Ms. Wallington first. Is that because of the nature of the complaint, or do you think there's still room for change there? And really, if you could talk through, if someone goes to a nominated officer and makes a complaint, it goes through the system. How is it that the line manager of a bit of this, or a business area manager, takes on the learning that might mean that there needs to be a change? We'll start with Ms. Pickles.
So I think, as Esther said earlier, we very much look at that on a kind of, again, a case-by-case basis. And the reason why the actual change to policy or procedure as it stands is relatively low is because invariably these cases are around a policy or procedure perhaps not being followed properly as it should be. And that is where then we would look at the most appropriate route, I think, as Esther said, to, if it's happening in a particular team, perhaps ask them to repeat training, do some bespoke work with that area to make sure that they understand.
From what you're saying, you don't think there's some big area that's being... This is not a sign that something's being missed. You're confident. You sound very confident in what you're saying there.
Yeah, and we look at this alongside... So whistleblowing investigations are looked at alongside all the other kind of HR casework investigations that we do into a whole range of the employee experience and what's going on in the department. So whilst we might not be able to say it's particularly because of a whistleblowing element and because our numbers are relatively small, if one of those was about something, for example, I think in recruitment policy was mentioned, but that had also come up as an issue that had come up through another route and another manager had got something wrong, we pick it up as kind of that broader review of what's going on, what's going wrong, for want of a better word, more broadly in the organisation, and how do we need to address that. And what we find, I think, in probably 9 times out of 10 cases, it's not the original policy that was incorrect. We might need to improve the guidance, we might need to improve the training around it, but the actual policy that was in place wasn't incorrect. Okay. It's just how do we improve people's understanding of it as a result of the
Wallington, so you're nodding, so you agree with that?
Very similar. Small numbers of cases where there's a case to answer. Those, the report will then be sent to the person that needs to take action on the findings of the case, and those will be followed through, and we monitor those through the HR process.
And we've talked quite a bit about how you have speak outs. There's I think DCMS has a stories that they tell. One of the ways of encouraging a good culture of whistleblowing or complaint raising is to tell the story. So how well are you doing that to say, well, someone raised this concern and this is what happened? Do you publicise and promulgate that kind of information in your departments? Ms. Wallington?
We wouldn't in that way typically from whistleblowing because the numbers are small, so I think they can be identified. But we do, there's sort of I think, three key stages. One is, how do we set the standards that we expect in the organisation? How do we help people understand those? And some of that's brought to life in different training methods. It might be specific cases, or it might be something, more policy or legislation related, but very clear standards through professional bodies that people are a part of, but also through our customer charter, the Civil Service Code, and our internal commitments. So those are very, very clear, and that's what people receive training on when they join, and then annually. The second thing is making sure that people understand how to speak out, and that's where we have the week where we have people, different executive committee members, might do videos or dial-ins. We publicise the information about how people can raise concerns, and that sort of helps bring it to life a bit for people. And then the third bit is making sure that people have the support when they raise a concern, and if they're thinking about raising concern, can find the information quickly about what that might entail and how to go about it. So that's how we help people understand what's expected,
and the journey that they would go through. Anything to add, Ms. Pickles? Or
and I just did that in large organisations such as DWP and HMRC, so much of this is around sort of line manager capability and the kind of culture that they're setting locally. So a really important part of our work, again, with the Cabinet Office, is on the sort of line manager standards across the civil service, and kind of instilling the right leadership behaviours in our line managers, and making sure that we're setting the right culture locally, so that people, alongside all the sort of global processes that we might put in place as the organisation, they can find that route and build that trust and have the right culture.
That brings me to my last question, and maybe I'll start with Ms. Ryland. But we've looked at a bit at some of the arm's length bodies, and some are quite small, and so but we've got here two big departments with lots of managers, lots of employees, of very well-worn systems. Is there any thought to actually just rolling up some of the whistleblowing processes from smaller organisations so that the bigger departments are sponsoring them? Because just to maintain a high standard.
Yeah, I mean, that's something we can take a look at. What I would say is that we provide the model policies that exactly for those departments or those.
But the point is, I mean, with Ms. Pickles, they've got the internal audit as their hotline, and that's not the case for everybody. Yeah. But if you're in a small arm's length body, it's harder because you're a smaller organisation quite often, and. Is there any just to maintain the quality? Is there any thought that they could just piggyback on to another department?
We can look at the opportunity for that, particularly with their home departments. Yeah. So we can take that away.
Anything to add there, Ms. Wallington, Ms. Pickles?
I think it would need to be a choice of the accounting officer, and they would need to maintain the accountability for the organisation. But there's certainly opportunities through service provision, and we've got different ways of providing services.
I can see that there will be accounting officer issues which need to be dealt with. Ms. Pickles, any thoughts?
Nothing to add on that.
Okay. Any
Could I have a point of order, Madam Chairman? Just because Hansard won't pick it up, I held this document up, but I should actually say what it is. It was obtained from gov.uk. It's the Single Source Regulations Office whistleblowing policy, corporate report on whistleblowing policy.
Okay, thank you. And we can provide our good colleagues at Hansard with a copy to make life easy for them. Can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time? This is a hugely important issue. We all want a good, honest civil service to do the job as well as it can, spending taxpayers' money wisely. And so, complaints procedures and whistleblowers are really important to make sure that there's honesty, to help make sure there's honesty in the system, and we want them to be supported. I think there has been some progress since we last discussed this, but I think it's very refreshing to have witnesses recognising that everything's not yet perfect and there's more to be done. So we do appreciate that, and we'll reflect that in our report. And thank you again to the National Audit Office for doing this work, which I think from hearing from witnesses is being found useful within the civil service, as well as to us holding the civil service and government to account. So thank you very much indeed for your time. The transcript of this session will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and we will be producing a report. I don't want to push the clerks here, but maybe it might be it'll probably be around or just after the May recess. So can I thank you very much indeed. Order.
Proceeding has ended. The 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 proceeding has ended.